The battlefield of containing the Chinese Communist Party is constantly shifting. On March 13th, a sudden development came from Belgium. Police raided the Brussels office of the Chinese tech company Huawei, which is located at the headquarters of the European Union. A spokesperson for the Belgian prosecutor's office said the raid was part of an investigation into a cash for influence scheme. Authorities are looking into preliminary allegations of corruption, document forgery, and money laundering involving the European Parliament. The prosecutor added that police targeted 21 locations in Brussels, Flanders, Wallonia, and Portugal. More than 100 officers carried out searches, and several people have been arrested. This is part of a large-scale investigation into corruption involving members of the European Parliament. Belgian media and the investigative group Follow the Money first reported that Huawei was a key target in this probe. The locations raided included the company's Brussels office. The Financial Times also cited an official familiar with the investigation, confirming that Belgium's intelligence agency had launched the probe with Huawei as a target. According to the federal prosecutor's office, those under investigation are suspected of falsifying documents and forming a criminal organization under the guise of business lobbying. These activities date back to at least 2021. Similar raids were also carried out in Portugal. The alleged crimes include paying European lawmakers for political statements and offering excessive gifts such as food, travel expenses, or regular invitations to football matches. Investigators believe these payments were disguised as conference fees and intermediary costs to hide their illegal nature or help those involved avoid consequences. Prosecutors said the goal of these activities was to influence EU policies in favor of business interests and potentially facilitate money laundering. Two people working at Huawei's main EU lobbying office in Brussels told Politico Europe that they saw police entering the building on the morning of March 13th. Officers remained inside until around noon. During the search, police seized several documents and other items. Staff at Huawei's Brussels office refused to comment and turned off the lights inside the office to prevent anyone from taking photos through the windows. Brussels-based news outlet Follow the Money, Belgian newspaper Le Soir, and Dutch-language weekly NAC were the first to report that Huawei was a major focus of the investigation. Reports say the early morning raid was part of a secret investigation that began nearly 2 years ago after Belgium's intelligence agency received a tip. Follow the Money reported that both Huawei's EU office and the homes of its lobbyists were among the raided locations. This marks the second corruption case involving the European Parliament in less than 3 years. Belgian media reported that around 15 members of the European Parliament have drawn the attention of investigators. These lawmakers were allegedly invited on luxury trips to China and may have even received cash in exchange for supporting Huawei when the company faced obstacles in Europe. Prosecutors stated that financial benefits linked to corruption may have been disguised as payments for conference fees and funneled through various intermediaries. The goal was to hide the illegal nature of these transactions or allow those involved to escape consequences. Huawei has been under pressure in Europe for years. The European Commission has urged all 27 EU member states to remove the company from their telecommunications networks due to security concerns. However, not all countries have complied with this recommendation. Two sources told the Financial Times that some of those arrested were former members of the European Parliament. A spokesperson for the European Parliament said they had received a request from Belgian authorities for cooperation in the investigation and would fully comply. Victor Negrescu, vice president of the European Parliament in charge of transparency and anti-corruption efforts, called the allegations deeply concerning. He said, "We cannot accept that individuals under accusations are the ones influencing decisions and drafting European legislation." The developments in Brussels bring to mind a classified episode from 5 years ago. At the time, President Donald Trump was reportedly furious when the UK insisted on allowing Huawei into its telecommunications infrastructure. During his first term, Trump radically shifted U.S. policy on China, from engagement to resistance and confrontation. However, America's long-term allies in Europe did not follow his lead. This left the Trump administration to take on the Chinese Communist Party alone on the international stage. One major example of this divide side was the effort to block Huawei, a Chinese tech giant with military ties, from expanding its 5G network in the West. A newly published book, Choke Points: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, details how the Trump administration spent considerable effort trying to convince European allies to reject Huawei. Despite these efforts, many European countries continued deploying Huawei's 5G technology. With allies unwilling to join, the Trump team had to act alone. Fortunately, the U.S. had the strength to prevail in the end. After taking office in January 2017, the Trump administration spent 2 years convincing both Democrats and Republicans in Washington that China's so-called peaceful rise was not actually peaceful. The Chinese Communist Party was a threat and a rival, and the U.S. needed to adjust its foreign policy accordingly. However, Europe remained eager to do business with China. In late April 2019, the UK decided to move forward with its 5G rollout using Huawei technology. The decision left the Trump administration shocked and frustrated. At the time, US officials had reached a consensus on Huawei. They believed that although Huawei presented itself as a private Chinese tech company, in reality it was an extension of the Chinese government and a key player in advancing Beijing's geopolitical agenda. Any sensitive data passing through Huawei's 5G equipment, including base stations, antennas, and switches, could fall within China's vast surveillance network. Even more concerning was the potential global spread of Huawei's technology. U.S. officials feared that one day Beijing could use Huawei's equipment to remotely disrupt the economic and military operations of its rivals. If much of the world became dependent on Huawei to manage cities, factories, and even military systems, the Chinese Communist Party could effectively paralyze entire societies to impose its will. The fact that the UK, one of America's closest allies, embraced Huawei despite strong opposition from the White House was a troubling sign. If Washington couldn't stop Britain, other Western nations looking to build 5G infrastructure might follow suit, attracted by Huawei's large-scale technology and low prices. Matt Pottinger was a key member of Trump's China Hawk team. As the senior director of Asia at the White House National Security Council and its leading China expert, he played a crucial role in shifting U.S. policy on China during Trump's first 2 years in office. Later, in the final year of Trump's term, he was promoted to Deputy National Security Advisor. Pottinger, fluent in Mandarin, often acted as a translator for Trump and senior officials in his inner circle. He provided direct explanations of the real meaning behind the words and actions of Chinese leaders. This made him a target of CCP distrust. In fact, when Trump visited China in 2017, Xi Jinping invited Trump to tour the Forbidden City, but specifically barred Pottinger from attending. Then National Security Officer H.R. McMaster suspected that Xi wanted to present his own version of history to Trump without being challenged by someone as well-versed as Pottinger. As for the Huawei issue, in the months leading up to the UK's announcement of its partnership with Huawei, Pottinger and other Trump officials repeatedly urged their British counterparts to exclude the company from their 5G networks. They even warned that if the UK went ahead with Huawei, the US might stop sharing intelligence with them. Despite these warnings, on April 23, 2019, then UK Prime Minister Theresa May approved Huawei's participation in the country's 5G rollout during a meeting with the UK's National Security Council. The news was first leaked by the Daily Telegraph. A few days later, Pottinger and 2 colleagues boarded a flight to London for another attempt to persuade the UK government to abandon Chinese-made 5G infrastructure. The Americans saw British officials as overconfident, believing they could mitigate any potential security risks posed by Huawei. Meanwhile, the British viewed the Americans as stubborn and overbearing. A senior official from the UK's Signals Intelligence Agency, GCHQ, later told the media, Pottinger was just shouting, completely uninterested in Britain's analysis. His message was simply, "We don't want you to do this. You don't understand how evil the CCP is." Pottinger denied that he had been shouting, but it was clear that the divide between the two allies was significant, and tensions were high. During his meetings with British officials, Matt Pottinger became convinced that the UK's decision to welcome Huawei was not based on a technical risk assessment, but rather on political calculations. After Brexit, Britain needed new economic partners, and it had chosen to court China. Pottinger left London feeling discouraged. Most members of the US government doubted whether it was still possible to stop Huawei from dominating the 5G market. Ivan Kanapathy, a former U.S. Marine Corps fighter pilot who worked under Pottinger at the time, remembered the skepticism surrounding their efforts. Kanapathy now holds the same position that Pottinger once did, serving as a senior director for Asia at the National Security Council under Trump's second administration. In response to the growing challenge, Pottinger turned to the U.S. Department of Commerce for help. On May 21, 2019, Huawei was added to the sanctions entity list. However, this move seemed to have little impact on the company's operations. Even when Huawei was cut off from U.S. chip manufacturers, it could still source chips from suppliers in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan without restrictions. If the U.S. truly wanted to stop Huawei, it wasn't enough to sever ties between American businesses and the company. European and Asian firms also needed to follow suit. However, Europe was unwilling to cooperate. On January 24, 2020, Trump personally called the then UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, urging him to reverse the decision on Huawei. Johnson refused to back down. Furious, Trump accused him of betrayal and abruptly ended the call. With no allied coalition to rely on, the Trump administration took a unilateral approach. The U.S. Department of Commerce invoked the Foreign Direct Product Rule, FDPR, to pressure Huawei's global business partners. FDPR was a little-known U.S. policy first introduced in 1959. Originally, it stated that if foreign factories used American technology to manufacture missile components or other sensitive items, those products would still fall under U.S. export controls. A new version of FDPR specifically targeting Huawei had the potential to block chip sales to the company from anywhere in the world, as long as those chips were made using American technology. In reality, nearly all of the world's advanced semiconductors rely on intellectual property, design software, and manufacturing tools developed by American companies. While most chips are produced outside the U.S., American industries contribute 39% of the total value in the semiconductor supply chain. In contrast, Chinese companies account for only about 6%. No other country comes close to matching the U.S. in this sector. On May 15, 2020, the U.S. Department of Commerce introduced an upgraded version of the FDPR. This became one of the Trump administration's most powerful economic weapons in its effort to contain Huawei. The new FDPR had significant consequences. For example, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, the world's largest semiconductor foundry, counted Huawei as its second largest customer after Apple. Huawei made up more than 15% of TSMC's revenue. However, TSMC relied on American software and equipment to power its operations. Under the new FDPR, semiconductor manufacturers had to choose. They could either continue selling to Huawei or continue using U.S. technology, but not both. Before the Trump administration formally imposed FDPR restrictions on Huawei, a classified FBI investigation had already provided strong evidence of the risks posed by Huawei's equipment. Then Attorney General Bill Barr briefed the White House on the FBI's secret findings. One key conclusion was that Huawei devices installed in cell towers near sensitive U.S. military facilities, particularly in the Midwest, could intercept or even disrupt communications related to America's nuclear arsenal. In a crisis, Beijing could potentially use Huawei's infrastructure as a kill switch, crippling U.S. command and control over its nuclear weapons. Barr warned that if Huawei became the backbone of the next-generation internet, the economic leverage that China would gain would make current U.S. sanctions look weak by comparison. In June 2020, Huawei launched a full-page advertising campaign in British newspapers to sway public opinion. Despite intense pressure from Trump, Boris Johnson continued resisting a ban on Huawei. However, after the U.S. Department of Commerce officially published its FDPR announcement and regulatory details, the UK government quickly launched an emergency review of Huawei's role in its 5G network. Soon, British telecom companies reluctantly admitted that Huawei's low-cost appeal might no longer be enough. If Huawei couldn't secure high-end chips, its product's performance and long-term maintenance would become uncertain. Even before the UK completed its review, the country's largest telecom operators had already begun distancing themselves from Huawei. On July 14, 2020, the UK government announced that it would remove Huawei from its 5G network. Another key factor in Boris Johnson's decision was China's imposition of the Hong Kong National Security Law on June 30th, just 2 weeks earlier. The crackdown on Hong Kong's freedoms deeply affected the UK, and Johnson saw no other viable way to respond. The UK government's Huawei ban was comprehensive. Starting from December 31st, 2020, British telecom operators were completely prohibited from purchasing 5G equipment from Huawei. By the end of 2027, all Huawei equipment would be removed from the UK's 5G network. This decision was expected to cost the UK around $2.5 billion and delay its 5G rollout by 3 years. More and more experts had come to realize that Huawei was actually one of the Chinese Communist Party's most powerful tools. By then, it had already infiltrated deep into the heart of Europe and North America, posing a significant risk. Clues about Huawei's influence could also be found in certain U.S. mainstream media reports, which had been heavily infiltrated or even controlled by the CCP. 5 years ago, the New York Times Chinese edition published a lengthy commentary when Trump and the UK clashed over Huawei. The article emphasized that British cybersecurity officials considered the risks posed by Huawei to be manageable. The article mocked Trump, saying he had spent a year trying to convince America's European allies that Huawei posed a serious national security threat and should be completely banned from developing next-generation wireless networks, but was ruthlessly rejected by the UK. It concluded by saying Europe has become the key battleground in the Huawei debate. While the US has effectively blocked Huawei, the company had already established deep roots in Europe, working closely with major operators such as Deutsche Telekom, Vodafone, and BT Group. Europe is Huawei's second-largest market after China. The recent developments in Belgium have been encouraging. Not long ago, similar revelations about Huawei also emerged in South Korea. On March 1st, former South Korean lawmaker Min Kyung-wook uploaded a video to his YouTube channel featuring Matt Schlapp, chairman of the Conservative Political Action Conference CPAC. The speech took place on the eve of the 2025 CPAC event. During a dinner gathering, Min Kyung-wook reportedly asked Schlapp to help South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol avoid impeachment. At the time, Matt Schlapp revealed, "I asked the president several times, what was this election thing?" He goes, "I was up in all the polls, and then the election came out. I won by 1%. He goes, "I just couldn't believe it, so there's something wrong." I asked, "Well, who runs your elections?" I didn't get an answer. "Who runs your elections?" I didn't get an answer. Third question, "Who runs your elections?" He said, "Huawei runs South Korean elections." Earlier, on February 26, Schlapp also posted on X that he had met with President Yoon in Seoul. According to Schlapp, Yoon expressed outrage over the use of Chinese Communist Party technology to influence South Korea's election outcome. The final battle between the free world and the CCP has already begun. Huawei, the infiltration tool that Beijing has spent years embedding worldwide, has now been fully exposed and is on the brink of collapse. Without a doubt, this signals the inevitable outcome of this conflict.